Yesterday, inside a packed BC Place in Vancouver, the scoreboard flashed a reality that the current administration in Washington has spent the last 18 months trying to legislate out of existence. On June 18, 2026, Canada did something it had never done in its entire footballing history. It won a World Cup match. And it did not merely win. It dismantled Qatar 6-0 in front of 52,497 fans, while Prime Minister Mark Carney and the President of FIFA sat side by side in the luxury suites. Jonathan David bagged a hat-trick, Cyle Larin opened the floodgates in the 16th minute, and Nathan Saliba buried a clinical free kick. By the time the final whistle blew, Canada had tripled its all-time World Cup goal total in a single evening, matching the largest margin of victory by a host nation in tournament history. Tying records held by Italy in 1934, Brazil in 1950, and Argentina in 1978. This was the largest margin of victory by any CONCACAF team ever at a men's World Cup. As Jesse Marsch, their American-born head coach, walked off the pitch holding up 6 fingers to a shaking stadium, it became immediately clear that this result was not a sports highlight. It was a geopolitical event. That is the headline. But here is the other half of the story, the piece that most mainstream coverage completely missed. One night later, across the border in Seattle, the United States men's national team faced Australia. The Americans won 2-0, but the substance of those 2 goals tells an entirely different story. The first was an own goal, deflected into the net by an Australian defender in the 11th minute. The second came off a chaotic deflected shot that required a lengthy video assistant referee review before it was allowed to stand. Throughout the entire second half, the United States managed exactly one shot. Their marquee player, Christian Pulisic, watched from the bench with an injury, and by the 70th minute, the American stadium fell silent as Australia dictates the pace of play. 2 co-host nations delivered 2 radically different performances on consecutive nights. One looked like a world-class program arriving on the global stage. The other looked like an elite institution merely surviving. The widening gap between these 2 performances exposes a structural narrative that extends far beyond the pitch, directly mirroring the high-stakes economic war currently playing out between Ottawa and Washington. To understand why this sporting contrast carries such heavy strategic weight, we have to look at the timeline of infrastructure and capital investment. The official narrative tells us that dominance is bought through sheer economic scale. Over the past 3 decades, the United States has poured more than $11 billion into soccer infrastructure through Major League Soccer alone, establishing 30 professional clubs, 27 purpose-built stadiums, and elite training academies in every major metropolitan market. 5 of those multi-million-dollar MLS venues are hosting World Cup matches this summer. The American professional system has been stable since 1996, deliberately constructed as a legacy condition of hosting the 1994 World Cup. Canada, by contrast, built its current success on the brink of institutional bankruptcy. When Jesse Marsch was hired as head coach in May 2024, Canada Soccer was in such severe financial distress that his salary had to be partially subsidised by 3 independent MLS clubs and private corporate donors. The National Federation quite literally could not afford to pay its own manager. The country's domestic professional women's league, the Northern Super League, only managed to launch in 2025. Furthermore, Canada's men's national team endured a 36-year drought between World Cup appearances, from 1986 until 2022. In Qatar 4 years ago they collapsed, losing all 3 group matches and returning home without a single point. Yet today, in 2026, operating with a fraction of the American infrastructure and a coaching staff funded partly by private charity, Canada sits alone at the top of Group B with 4 points, a +6 goal differential, and is on the absolute verge of advancing to the knockout round of the Men's World Cup for the first time in its history. Subscribe to Canada SR for clear, fact-driven analysis on how these institutional shifts reshape our national position. This brings us to the core analytical layer. The scoreboard directly contradicts the macroeconomic pressure campaign being waged against Canadian sovereignty. For the last 18 months, the President of the United States has publicly and repeatedly referred to Canada as the 51st state. This is not casual rhetoric, it is a sequenced political and diplomatic operation. He has broadcast this message on Truth Social, reiterated it on Fox News, and openly declared it at the World Economic Forum in Davos. When macroeconomic data revealed that Canada's gross domestic product had contracted for 2 consecutive quarters, Washington responded with a single public phrase, 51st state. When pressed by media analysts on why he was adopting a more hostile posture toward Ottawa than toward traditional foreign adversaries, the American president stated plainly that it was only because Canada was meant to be their 51st state. This overt rhetorical assault directly shaped the current Canadian political landscape. Mark Carney, who assumed office as Prime Minister in March 2025, secured his electoral victory in large part by mobilising public backlash against these direct threats to Canadian independence. Carney's defensive strategy has been consistent, assertive and blunt, stating that Canada does not live because of the United States, but thrives because we are Canadian. Ontario Premier Doug Ford reinforced this sovereignty doctrine even more aggressively, publicly stating that Canada will never be the 51st state and is absolutely not for sale. Now these two deeply polarised nations are co-hosting the largest sporting spectacle on Earth, and the friction is visible. Washington explicitly intended to use this World Cup as a grand showcase for American soft power. The American president held the tournament trophy in the Oval Office back in August 2025 and aggressively lobbied to host the World Cup draw ceremony at the Kennedy Center in Washington. FIFA President Gianni Infantino has maintained an unprecedentedly close personal relationship with the White House, even presenting the American president with a newly manufactured Peace Prize at the December draw ceremony. But soft power cannot be completely manufactured by executive decree. When the American leader appeared at an NBA Finals game in New York on June 8th, the crowd at Madison Square Garden drowned him out with intense booing. When the United States national hockey team secured a gold medal at the Winter Olympics earlier this year, the administration immediately inserted itself and federal law enforcement directors into the victory circle, instantly transforming a moment of national athletic unity into a flashpoint of political division. As the World Cup progresses, the internal domestic contradictions of the American host state are spilling into the international arena. The American Civil Liberties Union recently characterized the current domestic political climate as the most restrictive period for civil rights in the United States since the 1960s. The administration's sweeping travel restrictions have directly impacted citizens from multiple competing nations, including Iran and Haiti. Due to this hostile diplomatic environment, the Iranian national team has been forced to fly back and forth to Mexico for each of their group stage matches rather than base their operations within the United States. Just days before the opening match, a Somali referee designated to officiate tournament games was abruptly denied entry to the country by American border authorities. Consequently, multiple foreign governments have issued official travel advisories for their citizens attending the tournament, prompting thousands of international fans to liquidate their tickets rather than travel through American ports of entry. 20 separate executives from European football federations went so far as to hold formal talks regarding a potential tournament boycott. In the exact centre of this geopolitical storm, Canada is quietly executing the most dominant athletic performances in its national history, proving that domestic stability and institutional alignment matter far more than raw capital injection. Consider the strategic irony of the man orchestrating this Canadian breakthrough. Jesse Marsch is not a product of the Canadian system. He is an American citizen, born in Racine, Wisconsin. He played 14 seasons in Major League Soccer and earned caps for the United States national team. When he was dismissed by Leeds United in early 2023, he was the mathematical favourite to become the next head coach of the United States program. He participated in extensive interviews and turned down lucrative English Premier League offers because he was assured the American Federation would select him. Instead, US Soccer rejected him, opting to rehire their previous manager. Marsch accepted the Canadian position in May 2024 and immediately weaponized his platform. At a high-profile press conference in Los Angeles, When asked how he navigated coaching Canada during a period of intense bilateral hostility, Marsh delivered a statement that reverberated across Ottawa and Washington, noting that, as an American, he was deeply ashamed of the arrogance and disregard his home country had shown toward one of its oldest, strongest, and most loyal allies. He stated publicly that he was proud to lead a Canadian team that embodies integrity, respect, and collective effort. That single declaration transformed an athletic coach into a symbol of Canadian sovereign resistance. Double Olympic gold medalist Donovan Bailey remarked that Marsh had successfully challenged the American exceptionalist system, earning the respect of the entire Canadian public. Jim Cuddy of Blue Rodeo noted that Marsh had effectively issued a formal apology on behalf of the millions of Americans who reject the current Washington administration's foreign policy. Today, that exact coach is systematically outperforming the nation that cast him aside. While the United States hired Mauricio Pochettino on a multi-million-dollar contract to grind out narrow, error-dependent victories, Marsh has implemented a ruthless, high-possession tactical system that is maximizing Canadian potential on the world stage. This athletic divergence is unfolding against the backdrop of a brutal, ongoing trade war. In February 2025, Washington slapped 25% tariffs on the vast majority of Canadian industrial goods and a 10% tariff on Canadian energy exports. Ottawa retaliated instantly, deploying counter-tariffs on $30 billion worth of American products, with legislative frameworks prepared to scale that retaliation to $155 billion. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the very trade vehicle that governs our continental commerce, faces a mandatory joint review in July 2026. Canada has formally requested a 16-year stable renewal of the pact. The White House has countered by stating publicly that they have no intention of renewing the deal under current terms. The vulnerability of Canada's position was laid bare during the most recent round of trade negotiations in Mexico City. Canadian diplomats were completely excluded from the room. The United States and Mexico met strictly on a bilateral basis, sidelining Ottawa, while Washington pushed a protectionist mandate requiring 82% of all automotive components to be produced regionally, with 50% of that specific value locked entirely within the borders of the United States. If enacted, this policy would effectively liquidate Canada's domestic automotive manufacturing sector. Under the weight of this tariff uncertainty, the Canadian economy contracted for 2 consecutive quarters, entering a technical recession engineered almost entirely by trade weaponization from our southern neighbour. Yet, while Washington attempts to starve Canadian industry, the domestic population is demonstrating an unyielding sovereign identity. Thousands of citizens have flooded the streets of Vancouver, transforming the Granville Corridor into a sea of red reminiscent of the 2010 Winter Olympic Games. Prime Minister Carney deliberately used the Qatar match to project national solidarity, entering the locker room afterward to praise the squad's resilience following a catastrophic broken leg injury suffered by midfielder Ismail Kone. Instead of fracturing under adversity, the Canadian team rallied, with substitute Nathan Saliba scoring moments later to seal the 6-0 rout. Marsh framed the evening as a seminal demonstration of domestic talent, mentality, and collective desire, promptly signing a contract extension through the 2030 World Cup cycle to anchor the program in Canadian soil. Meanwhile, the mood across the border remains sterile. While the United States has technically qualified for the knockout round, the domestic response has been utterly muted. The performances have been strictly functional, lacking any corporate or public enthusiasm, while the broader tournament administration is choked by constant geopolitical friction. The Council on Foreign Relations and the London School of Economics have both published grim assessments, concluding that Washington has transformed the World Cup into an aggressive arena for unilateral political theatre rather than global unity. The structural decoupling is even visible in tourism metrics. While Canadian leisure travel to the United States has plummeted to historic lows since the onset of the tariff war, Canadian citizens are spending their capital at home, packing stadiums in Toronto and Vancouver to absolute maximum capacity. The economic and cultural passion is not migrating south. It is consolidating domestically. 4 years ago, Canada could not secure a single World Cup point. 2 years ago, it could not afford to pay its manager's salary. Today, in the face of predatory tariffs, systemic exclusion from continental trade negotiations, and a targeted rhetorical campaign designed to delegitimize our very existence as an independent state, Canada is playing the most dominant, efficient football on the planet. The United States spent $11 billion, built 30 professional clubs, and hired Europe's most expensive tactical minds, only to produce an uninspired campaign defined by defensive errors and an inability to generate shots on goal. Canada raised private capital, stood its ground, and put 6 goals past an opponent in a single night. Washington wants the world to believe that Canada is an economic dependency waiting to be absorbed as a 51st state. But the scoreboard in Vancouver proved that neither executive decrees, nor predatory tariffs, nor unilateral trade isolation can suppress a sovereign nation that possesses superior structure, discipline, and collective will. But the most consequential question remains unanswered. How does a nation under total economic siege outmaneuver a superpower when the rules of the game are explicitly written to guarantee its defeat? To find the answer, we must strip away the pageantry of the World Cup and dissect the architectural design of the policy currently threatening the foundation of Canadian industry. This is not a standard regulatory dispute. It is a meticulously coordinated structural alignment orchestrated by Washington, executed through the upcoming July 2026 review of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. www.brookings.edu, the official line from the Office of the United States Trade Representative, presents this review as a routine, 6-year performance evaluation under Article 34.7 of the Pact. The public is told it is simply a mechanism to modernize trade rules, ensure labor compliance, and streamline North American supply chains. That is the diplomatic cover story. But the underlying strategic architecture reveals a completely different motive. An aggressive bilateral squeeze play designed to isolate Ottawa, decimate Canada's manufacturing core, and force a sovereign nation into economic submission. www.is.org. The true mechanics of this operation became visible during the recent ministerial summits in Mexico City. The structural architecture of the American proposal breaks down into 3 predatory components, each precisely engineered to exploit Canada's current technical recession. First, Washington is pushing a radical overhaul of the automotive rules of origin. Under the current USMCA framework, 75% of a vehicle's components must be manufactured within North America to qualify for duty-free status. The new American text aggressively elevates this threshold to 82%. Crucially, it inserts an unprecedented sub-clause. 50% of that entire regional value must be produced exclusively within the geographic borders of the United States. www.prodensa.com. This is a direct strike at the heart of the Ontario automotive corridor. For decades, the North American auto sector has operated as an integrated, fluid ecosystem, with parts crossing the Detroit-Windsor border up to 7 times before a finished vehicle rolls off the line. By demanding a hard 50% domestic carve-out for American factories, Washington is effectively making it mathematically impossible for Canadian parts manufacturers to compete. It forces global automakers to systematically divest from Canadian facilities and relocate assembly lines to the American Midwest or face a crushing 25% border tariff. Second, the deal architecture reveals a calculated bilateral alignment between the United States and Mexico, deliberately constructed to sideline Canadian negotiators. During the Mexico City rounds, American officials chose to stall trilateral panels, opting instead for intense, closed-door bilateral sessions with the Mexican Economy Ministry. The strategic logic here is cold and effective. Buy off Mexico by preserving their access to the American consumer market, while leaving Canada completely isolated outside the room. Washington utilized Mexico's pressing domestic vulnerabilities, specifically intense American pressure over labor enforcement and energy sector state monopolies, as leverage. The United States offered Mexico a compromise: step aside on the automotive rules of origin and allow Washington to squeeze Canada. And in return, the United States would soften its use of the rapid response labor mechanism against Mexican factories. This maneuver successfully fractured the historic trilateral front, reducing Canada's diplomatic leverage to near zero and leaving Ottawa to face a united bilateral front. Third, the economic pressure is magnified by the calculated sequencing of national security tariffs under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. The 25% tariffs levied on Canadian industrial goods and the 10% tax on Canadian energy exports in February 2025 were not independent retaliatory measures. They are structural levers explicitly timed to maximise leverage ahead of the July 2026 Free Trade Commission meeting. By maintaining these tariffs throughout the preparatory phase of the review, Washington has artificially induced a technical recession in Canada, driving down corporate valuations and stalling capital investment across the country. The American administration is using a manufactured economic crisis as a cudgel, telling Canadian negotiators that the only way to lift the devastating energy and steel tariffs is to accept the new USMCA terms that will permanently hollow out their automotive and manufacturing sectors. It is an architecture of economic surrender. The financial terms of this confrontation are stark and entirely verifiable. The USMCA currently governs nearly $2 trillion in annual continental trade, and 85% of Canada's merchandise exports are directly tied to the American market. The automotive sector alone represents over 14 billion Canadian dollars in annual economic output. Under the proposed 82% regional content rule, financial analysts project a direct capital flight of up to $4.8 billion out of Ontario's manufacturing sector within the first 24 months of execution. Furthermore, with the 10% energy tariff remaining active, Canada's energy sector is bleeding roughly $90 million per week in lost revenue, severely restricting Prime Minister Mark Carney's fiscal capacity to stimulate the domestic economy. www.cacis.org. Faced with this existential threat to Canadian sovereignty, the Carney administration is quietly pivoting toward an aggressive, multi-layered counter-strategy designed to exploit the internal contradictions of the American position. The Canadian response does not rely on appealing to Washington's sense of fairness. It focuses on structural asymmetric retaliation. To counter the automotive squeeze, Ottawa is preparing an expanded counter-tariff framework that targets exactly $30 billion worth of American products, specifically optimized to hit politically sensitive congressional districts in Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin, ahead of the American midterm legislative cycle. If Washington refuses to back down on the 50% domestic content requirement by the July deadline, Canada has legislated the authority to immediately scale that retaliation to $155 billion, targeting American agricultural exports and digital services simultaneously. Prime Minister Carney is leveraging Canada's vast critical mineral reserves as a geopolitical counterweight. While Washington seeks to build a domestic electric vehicle supply chain to compete with global adversaries, the raw materials required, lithium, cobalt, nickel, and copper, are heavily concentrated in northern Ontario and Quebec. Ottawa has quietly signalled to international trade syndicates that if Canada is excluded from the continental automotive framework, access to these critical mineral supply chains will be restricted, forcing American manufacturers to rely on highly volatile and expensive overseas markets. The strategy is clear. Canada is demonstrating that while it cannot match the raw economic scale of a superpower, it can inflict precise, unmanageable supply chain friction that American industry cannot easily absorb. This is the ultimate subtext of the current historical moment. While the world watches two national teams compete on the football pitches of Vancouver and Seattle, the real game is being played by sovereign strategists in boardroom negotiations, where the very definition of independent Canadian identity is being defended against an imperial economic mandate. But as the July deadline approaches, the most dangerous structural fault line in this entire geopolitical architecture has yet to be exposed. The systematic convergence of athletic brilliance in Vancouver and predatory trade architecture in Mexico City reveals a nation executing an entirely new doctrine of survival. While Canada's 6-0 sporting triumph over Qatar exposes the limits of raw capital, the structural components of the ongoing trade dispute demonstrate that Ottawa is actively preparing for an asymmetric, high-stakes decoupling from its largest economic partner, zooming out to the broader strategic canvas This moment marks the formal liquidation of the traditional Canada-United States special relationship. For nearly 8 decades following the Second World War, continental security and trade operated under a predictable institutionalized consensus based on mutual reliance and open borders. In the pre-Trump era, trade negotiations were functional exercises in regulatory harmonization, governed by shared democratic principles and an invisible assumption that a rising tide in Washington would naturally float all boats in Ottawa. That post-war consensus is entirely dead. The ongoing trade war, the punitive 25% automotive thresholds, and the overt rhetoric treating an independent G7 ally as the 51st state have fundamentally broken the trust that historically bound the two capitals together. Washington has explicitly transitioned from an ally into an extractive regional hegemon, using its massive market scale as an economic weapon to coerce its neighbours into industrial submission. Subscribe to Canada SR for clear, fact-driven analysis on how these institutional shifts reshape our national position. This structural collapse is forcing an unprecedented realignment across 3 critical sectors of Canadian national sovereignty, trade, energy, and continental defence. In the trade sector, the ongoing technical recession has permanently cured Ottawa of its historic over-reliance on the American consumer. The Mark Carney administration is rapidly accelerating a trade diversification strategy that bypasses North American infrastructure entirely. By systematically expanding commercial ties with middle powers in Europe and the Indo-Pacific region, Canada is positioning itself as a reliable, rules-based alternative to the increasingly protectionist and unpredictable American economy. The message to the international community is clear. Canada is open for global business, precisely because it is distinct from the United States. In the energy sector, the 10% tariff on Canadian petroleum and electricity exports has triggered a massive, state-directed infrastructure pivot. For decades, Canada's energy transport network was built strictly along a north-south axis, locking domestic producers into a single, monopsonistic American buyer that could dictate prices at will. Today, the punitive border taxes are accelerating the construction of westbound pipeline networks and maritime liquid natural gas terminals along the Pacific coast. This structural shift transforms Canadian energy from a captured continental utility into a highly liquid global asset, capable of supplying the massive energy demands of Japan, South Korea, and Western Europe without asking for permission from Washington. Most consequentially, this friction is destabilizing the continental defense architecture. Since the signing of the NORAD agreement in 1957, North American aerospace defense has operated as a singular, deeply integrated command structure. However, as Washington actively attempts to dismantle Canada's domestic industrial base, Canadian defense planners are facing a profound strategic paradox. How do you maintain a unified, high-integrity defense shield with a neighbour that openly questions your right to exist as an independent nation? The weaponization of trade is forcing Ottawa to quietly decouple its national security calculations from American multilateral commands, shifting focus toward direct defense capabilities in the Arctic and autonomous maritime surveillance. The global implications of this split are already reverberating through traditional alliances. For organisations like G7, NATO, and the Five Eyes intelligence network, the aggressive economic squeeze play against Ottawa demonstrates that Washington is willing to sacrifice long-term strategic alliances for short-term domestic political theatre. European capitals are watching the continental bullying of Canada with deep apprehension, recognising that if the United States is willing to economically liquidate its most loyal geographically contiguous partner, no transatlantic security guarantee can be considered permanent. The erosion of the Canada-US relationship is directly accelerating the fragmentation of the Western alliance, pushing middle powers into alternative security arrangements that operate completely independently of Washington's influence. This is the ultimate lesson of the current historical moment. A nation that was dismissed by its larger neighbour as an economic dependency has delivered the most dominant athletic performance in World Cup history, while systematically outmaneuvering a hostile administration on the diplomatic chessboard. The structural decoupling of North America is no longer a theoretical scenario. It is an active, ongoing reality. As the calendar moves toward the July 2026 Free Trade Commission review, the entire continental framework is rapidly approaching an existential tipping point. The Carney administration has laid down its strategic red lines, the counter-tariffs are locked into place, and the global mineral supply chains are prepared for disruption. The next critical juncture will not be decided by diplomatic compromises or empty political rhetoric, but by